The sky was heavy that afternoon, gray clouds gathering like an army, moving in slow, ominous waves. The town, nestled between rolling hills, seemed eerily quiet as the first gusts of wind started to whisper through the trees. There was something unsettling in the air, a feeling that the calm before the storm was not just about the weather. It was about something much deeper, something that would change everything. In the distance, the sound of children playing could still be heard, but it was fading. The playground, usually filled with laughter and the steady hum of life, now seemed distant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The town's familiar streets, lined with quaint houses and small businesses, seemed to pulse with an unseen tension. In the calm before the storm, a little girl was about to find herself lost in a way she never could have imagined. Her name was Emma, a curious, adventurous soul of just 8 years old. She had always found joy in the simple things, a flower petal drifting in the breeze, a stray cat hiding in a shadowed corner, the secret paths only she knew in the woods behind her home. But today, that curiosity would lead her into a situation far beyond her understanding, into the unknown, where the only thing that mattered would be survival. Unbeknownst to Emma's mother, Sarah, who was busy inside their small home preparing lunch, Emma had slipped out, drawn by the lure of adventure. She had wandered further than she realized, past the edge of the familiar and into the wild unknown. The world around her, once so safe, now seemed unfamiliar, strange, and even dangerous. The trees towered over her, their branches bending and twisting in ways that made the shadows feel like they were reaching out, trying to swallow her whole. By the time Sarah realized Emma was missing, it was already too late. Panic set in as she rushed through the house, calling her daughter's name. But there was no answer. No sound except for the wind, which was now howling, cutting through the town like a warning. Fear crept into her chest as she ran outside, the panic rising with every passing moment. "Emma!" she screamed, but the streets were empty. The familiar houses seemed to close in on her, their windows darkened, offering no answers. She ran to the neighbors, asked everyone, but there was no sign of her daughter. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The sun, once bright and inviting, had been swallowed by the clouds. The wind carried with it the scent of rain, but more than that, it carried an unsettling silence, a quiet before something unimaginable would unfold. Emma was lost, and in the midst of the growing storm, there was someone else who had noticed. A creature whose own life had been shaped by hardship and survival. A creature who, like Emma, knew what it meant to be lost. A stray dog. He had seen Emma from a distance, watching her as she wandered farther and farther from home. He had no name, no collar, and no master. He was a stray, forgotten by the world, left to fend for himself. His coat was rough, his eyes clouded with the weight of many lonely years. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something that stayed in the depths of his heart. A sense of connection, of knowing. He had walked the streets for so long, a solitary figure, surviving on scraps and hiding from danger, but today was different. Today, he couldn't turn away. If you believe in the power of kindness, stay with me until the end of this story. Because the story that was about to unfold, the one no one could have predicted, was about to change the lives of two lost souls forever. What happens when a stray dog finds a lost child in the middle of a storm? Could something as simple as kindness lead them back to safety? And would anyone believe that a creature with no name could become a hero? Stay with me, and I'll tell you. The air felt thick with tension as the storm clouds grew darker, a heavy blanket descending over the quiet town. Emma's small feet shuffled through the tall grass, each step further away from everything she knew, further away from home. The once familiar world had begun to feel alien, like an endless stretch of wilderness. She had wandered too far for any child to venture alone. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a cold chill that made Emma shiver, though she didn't fully realize the danger yet. She was still caught in the thrill of her little adventure, enjoying the peace of solitude, the quiet sound of her footsteps, the soft rustling of leaves. She had been walking for what felt like hours, far beyond the safety of the town, unaware of how far she had gone. Her eyes darted from one shadow to the next, and her heart began to beat a little faster, though she couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't until the first drop of rain splashed on her cheek that she realized something wasn't right. The storm was coming. Emma quickened her pace, but the path before her seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every way she turned looked the same: tall trees, thick grass, and a darkening sky. The safety of home was nowhere in sight. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the wind, lost in the vastness of the field. The world around her began to feel colder, more threatening. She tried not to panic, but her heart raced as her steps grew heavier, as the rain began to fall harder. It wasn't just rain, it was the weight of the unknown. Fear settled into her chest, but she refused to cry. She had to be brave. That was what her mother had always told her. Unbeknownst to Emma, she wasn't truly alone. Far behind her, a pair of eyes had been watching her from the shadows, and they had not left her sight since she stepped into the field. A stray dog. He had no name, no place to call home. He was a creature of the streets, battle-worn, abandoned. His fur was matted with date, his ribs slightly visible beneath the rough coat. But there was something about Emma that stirred something deep within him, something he had long forgotten. A glimmer of protection, a flicker of hope. The dog knew the way of the world. He knew how to survive, how to hide from the dangers that lurked in the dark, how to navigate a life with no one to care for you. And yet, as he watched the small girl walk deeper into the woods, his instincts kicked in. He could see the way her small form trembled, the way the storm weighed heavily on her fragile shoulders. He could see her fear, just as he had once felt. For a moment, the dog hesitated. He had never been one to approach others, especially humans. They had never been kind to him. But this was different. Something about Emma's vulnerability, her loneliness, spoke to him in a way nothing else had. The dog moved silently through the trees, his body blending into the shadows, his movements fluid, calculated. He stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice, but close enough to keep an eye on her. He wasn't sure why he had decided to follow her, but he knew one thing for certain. He could not let her wander off alone. Not in the storm. Not in this wild, unknown place. And then it happened. Emma stumbled. Her foot caught on a loose stone, and before she could steady herself, she fell to the ground, the rain soaking her through in an instant. The wind howled louder, pushing her into the mud. She cried out, but her voice was drowned by the storm. Her small hands pressed against the cold, wet earth as she tried to get back up, but exhaustion and fear had taken over. Her eyes filled with tears as she lay there, helpless, cold, and alone. This was it, she thought. She would never find her way home. And yet, as if on cue, the dog appeared. At first, Emma could barely make him out through the rain, but then, there he was, emerging from the shadows, his form outlined by the flickering flashes of lightning. She blinked, unsure if she was imagining him. Was he real? Or was he some kind of figment of her fear? But the dog didn't wait for her to find the answer. He was already there, his large body pressed against her, offering warmth, comfort, and a strange sense of safety. He nudged her with his nose, as if urging her to get up, to move. His eyes, brown and filled with quiet understanding, met hers. At first, Emma was too frightened to react, unsure whether this dog, ragged and scarred from years of roaming, was friend or foe. But something in his eyes, something soft, almost like a promise, made her reach out. Hesitantly, she touched the wet fur on his back, her fingers trembling. "Are you here to help me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The dog didn't answer in words. He didn't need to. Instead, he nudged her hand again, this time more insistent, urging her to stand. His body was warm, a stark contrast to the cold rain. He stood there, solid and unwavering, a silent protector in the midst of the storm. With a deep breath, Emma managed to push herself up, leaning against the dog for support. Together, they stood there, facing the storm, the darkness, the fear. The dog didn't leave her side. He didn't ask for anything in return. He simply stayed close, guiding her forward. Through the rain and the mud, the pair moved slowly, step by step, deeper into the woods. The dog's ears were perked, his eyes scanning their surroundings, alert for any danger. But for the first time, Emma felt a sense of calm. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time since she had wandered off, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she would make it home. As the hours passed, Emma's strength began to fade, her small body growing weaker with each step. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Her legs felt like they could no longer carry her, and her thoughts began to blur together. The rain was relentless, and the wind cut through her clothes, but the dog never faltered. At some point, Emma collapsed again, unable to keep going. The exhaustion had overtaken her. She was lost, truly lost now, as lost as she could ever be. But the dog didn't hesitate. He nudged her gently with his nose, trying to get her to move again. His movements were slow and deliberate, but there was something undeniable about his persistence. This time, Emma looked up at him, her eyes full of exhaustion. "I can't go on," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm too tired." The dog didn't speak. He simply lay down beside her, wrapping his body around hers, offering her warmth, protection, and a quiet promise that she was not alone. And in that moment, as the storm raged on outside, Emma found something inside her, something deep and quiet, that told her she was going to be okay. She was no longer lost. Not with him by her side. Together, they waited for the storm to pass. As the storm continued its relentless assault, the hours seemed to stretch on, each minute heavier than the last. Emma and the stray dog lay side by side in the abandoned cabin. The warmth of the dog's fur against her skin was a comfort in the cold, a small, unwavering presence in a world that had become so vast and terrifying. But despite the small reprieve the cabin provided, Emma couldn't shake the fear that lingered in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just the storm that frightened her, it was the uncertainty of it all. How far had she wandered? How long had she been lost? Was anyone even looking for her? The questions spiraled, each one feeding the other, until her thoughts became a tangled mess of worry. The dog, however, remained steadfast. He did not share her worries. He had no time for such things. For him, it was simple: stay close, protect, and survive. He had been through storms far worse than this, had fought battles he'd never won, had learned long ago that the world was not kind to those who were weak. But now, with this small, lost girl by his side, there was something new, a responsibility that felt both foreign and natural at the same time. Emma turned her face toward the dog. His brown eyes glistened in the dim light, and there was something in them that made her feel less alone. His eyes said everything. He wasn't afraid, and he would not leave her. "I'm scared," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog lifted his head, sensing the deep sadness in her tone. He gave a soft whimper and, with a gentle movement, nuzzled her hand. His body was cold, wet from the rain, but he was warm in spirit. He didn't understand words, but he understood fear. In that moment, Emma's heart swelled with gratitude. She had no idea what she would have done without him. She had no idea where she was, or how far she had to go to get back home, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Not as long as the dog stayed with her. The storm raged outside, but Emma began to feel a small flicker of hope. The wind still howled, and the rain lashed against the walls of the cabin, but the dog's presence offered something else: a sense of peace. They stayed in the cabin for what felt like forever. Emma curled up on the floor, her head resting on the dog's body, listening to the storm outside. She didn't know if it was hours or days that passed, but eventually, the rain began to taper off. The wind died down, and the world outside seemed to settle into a calm that had been absent for far too long. The storm was over. The dog stood up and stretched, his muscles sore from hours of lying in place. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching as he tested the wind. Emma stirred, her eyes blinking open, and she sat up slowly, her body stiff from the cold and the hard ground. The dog's tail wagged slightly, a silent signal that it was time to move again. Emma glanced at the dog, her face still weary with fear and exhaustion. "Are we going home now?" she asked softly, her voice raw from the hours of crying. The dog didn't answer, of course. He never would. But he had made his decision. With a final glance back at her, he turned toward the door of the cabin, his movements deliberate. He wasn't going to leave her now, not when she needed him most. He had already shown her that he would stay by her side through the worst of it. He had done something no one had ever done for him. He had given her his trust. Emma, though tired, stood up and followed him. There was no other choice. She had nowhere else to go. Her small legs carried her as best as they could, though each step was a struggle. Her body was weak from the cold and the long walk, but she kept moving, just behind the dog. The path ahead was uncertain, but she knew that with him by her side, they could face anything together. As they walked through the now damp woods, The trees, which had once seemed menacing, now felt like guardians. The dog moved with confidence, his eyes alert as he led the way. It was as if he had done this 1,000 times before, leading others to safety, even if it was just a stray dog and a lost little girl. Emma couldn't help but admire his strength. He was so brave, so sure of himself. Even though he had no one, even though his life had been one of hardship and survival, here he was, showing her what it meant to be truly courageous. In a way, he had become her guide, her protector, her friend. The bond between them was silent but strong. She didn't need words to understand that this dog would keep her safe, no matter what. The path they followed wound through the woods, each step taking them closer to the town, but still so far away. Emma's energy began to drain again, and her legs grew weaker with each passing moment. She stumbled, once again, her small body unable to keep up with the demands of the journey. But the dog was there, always by her side. When she faltered, he nudged her with his nose, urging her forward. When she fell, he barked softly, coaxing her to rise again. He was relentless in his devotion, and Emma, exhausted and overwhelmed, clung to that devotion as if it were the only thing keeping her from slipping into despair. The darkness of the woods was no longer something to fear. The storm had passed, and the dog was with her. And so, despite her weariness, Emma pressed on. The dawn finally broke, soft and golden, pushing away the remnants of the storm with the first light of morning. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after a storm, peaceful, almost sacred. The sky was clearing, the clouds parting as though they had been driven away by the winds of fate. The woods, once dark and ominous, now appeared less threatening. The path ahead of Emma and the dog was visible again, bathed in the gentle warmth of the early sun. But the journey was not over yet. Emma was tired. She could feel it in every bone, every muscle that screamed from exhaustion. Her small body, still soaked from the rain and covered in the dirt of her journey, could barely keep up with the dog. Yet, as they continued their walk, there was something different in her step. A quiet determination had replaced the fear in her eyes. She was no longer the lost child who had wandered too far. She was stronger now, in a way she couldn't fully understand. She had learned something on this journey, something deeper than the physical fatigue she felt. The dog, ever vigilant, had not slowed his pace. His body, though also tired, seemed to be carrying an invisible weight of responsibility. He moved forward with a sense of purpose, his every step measured, each one an unspoken promise. He had no reason to protect her, no obligation to stay by her side. But he had chosen her, and in that choice, he had found something that mattered more than survival. He had found a reason to keep moving. As they neared the edge of the woods, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. The first signs of civilization began to show themselves, distant rooftops peeking through the trees, the road beyond barely visible. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could feel it, the pull of home. She was getting closer, and though the journey had been long and difficult, she was finally nearing the place where she had started. And then, as if summoned by some unseen force, a shout broke the silence. Emma. It was Sarah. Emma's heart leapt in her chest, and the moment the sound of her mother's voice reached her ears, she burst into a run, despite the exhaustion still weighing her down. The dog, seeing her energy return, matched her pace, bounding beside her with a surprising burst of speed. Emma, Emma. Sarah cried again, her voice filled with a mix of relief, joy, and disbelief. Her figure appeared from behind the trees, her face pale from worry, her eyes wide with shock and love. Emma broke into a sob the moment she saw her mother. She ran to her, falling into Sarah's arms as the tears flowed freely from her eyes. The emotions of the past hours, of fear, of loneliness, of the uncertainty, came rushing out all at once. She clung to her mother, unable to speak through her sobs, but Sarah didn't need words. She just held her, stroking her hair, whispering soothing words into her ear. "You're safe. You're safe now, my sweet girl." And then, as if the moment wasn't enough, Emma looked up, her tear-streaked face brightening just a little. She glanced back toward the dog, who had stopped a few feet away, watching the reunion silently. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse, "he helped me. The dog. He saved me." Sarah turned to look at the dog. His fur was matted, his eyes tired, but there was something about the way he stood there, so proud, so calm, that made her heart swell with gratitude. This stray dog, this creature who had known nothing but hardship, had become Emma's protector. The dog met Sarah's gaze, his eyes full of understanding. There was no need for words. He had done what he set out to do. He had found Emma, kept her safe, and led her home. His task was done. Sarah slowly approached the dog, her steps cautious at first, but as she reached him, she knelt down and gently placed a hand on his head. He stiffened at the touch but didn't back away. His tired eyes softened as if he understood the gesture. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my daughter." The dog gave a soft, almost imperceptible wag of his tail, as if to acknowledge her thanks, and then turned to walk away. He wasn't looking for praise, for recognition. He had simply done what he felt was right. And now, his work was complete. He wasn't going to stay in the town with its people and its noise. He was a wanderer at heart, and the road ahead was calling him again. Emma, still in her mother's arms, watched the dog as he walked away. For a brief moment, she felt a pang in her chest. He had saved her, guided her home, and now he was leaving. She wanted to say something, to stop him from walking away, but words failed her. "Will we ever see him again?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and awe. "I don't know, sweetie," Sarah replied gently, her hand still resting on Emma's head. "But what matters is that he found you when you needed him, and you will always remember him." The dog disappeared into the distance, his figure growing smaller until he was just a shadow on the horizon. The town, with all its noise and bustle, awaited them. But Emma knew that no matter what happened next, she would never forget the stray dog who had given her the greatest gift of all, safety, companionship, and a reminder that kindness could still be found in the most unexpected places. As Emma and Sarah made their way back to the safety of their home, they carried with them more than just the memory of the storm. They carried with them the knowledge that there are good souls, even in the most unlikely places, whether human or animal, that are capable of extraordinary things. The stray dog had been more than just a wanderer in the woods. He had been a hero in the truest sense. His courage, his kindness, and his unshakable loyalty saved Emma in a way that words could never fully capture. If you've ever witnessed or experienced a moment of unexpected kindness, share your story below. Your words have the power to inspire others. This is just one of many inspiring stories we share. Subscribe to be part of a community that believes in hope, courage, and kindness. Because sometimes, the most incredible heroes are the ones we least expect. And so, the story of the stray dog, Emma, and the storm came to an end. But the lesson remained. In a world full of chaos, kindness is the one thing that can always lead us back home.